So happy birthday, Wolfgang, and hi everybody. I don't know if you know that we also have an anniversary. We both. It's, I'm going to round it up. It's like 10 years since we have been working together. Actually 11, but don't mention it. 10 years since we have been working together, and I decided to bring the whole story to a presentation where, you know, some people would want to speak about the past, some people would want to speak about the present, some people would want to speak about the future. I'm going to speak about everything. I'm going to speak about the past first. I'm going to tell you how I got to know, from a scientific point of view, how I got to know Wolfgang, what we did together in the period 2006 to 2013. I'm going to show you just some highlights. So I will tell you a little bit about our work on age structure, human capital and economic growth, and on our work on human capital and democratization processes, together with Yalan sitting there. And then I'm going to tell you about the present, about basically what we have been working on over the last years, something about basically using the models that we had developed in the years before in order to predict the future and project the future. And then, since Wolfgang is so busy, it's really difficult to find time to present and discuss with him the results of our new work. So I decided, I'll take the opportunity. I'll show you some of the results on economic growth accelerations and human capital. It's the kind of the birthday present part. And then I'm going to present you a very, very new surprise that Fabian, sitting there in the back, and myself prepared for you on big data, education quality, and eventually in the future, income growth. Okay? So I got to meet Wolfgang because he was interested in moving all the work that he was doing on demography into economic outcomes. He was interested in, well, what's the role of education dynamics on income growth and on economic development. Okay? Back when we met, the human capital and economic development literature was a little bit in an existential crisis. The microeconometric evidence was out there. There were billions of regressions that told you that people with higher levels of education tended to have also higher wages and were therefore, economists' leap of faith, were therefore more productive, and that therefore you should expect at the macroeconomic level the changes in the education level of countries should be correlated with economic growth. But that did not seem to appear in the data. And there were two strands of the literature trying to explain why it's the case that you don't see a positive correlation between accumulation in human capital, accumulation in education, and economic growth. One of these two strands of the literature was saying, well, you just got the specification wrong. You know, education does things to people that go beyond increasing their productivity. They also increase the likelihood of people having great ideas and being creative and creating a knowledge that will affect everybody's productivity. Okay, it was the so-called Nelson-Phelps hypothesis back in the 60s, and then materialized in a couple of models in the 90s by Benjamin and Spiegel. Some of the people, however, were saying, no, the problem is a data problem. People don't have the data that it takes in order to really tease out the effect of education and economic growth. Okay? And then I went to IASA once to meet, I think it was Alexia, who acted as the middle woman between Wolfgang and me. And Wolfgang showed me this. And well, like, look at what we have. We have here, you know, Anne and Samir, and they are creating these wonderful pyramids. Okay, we're like, oh, cool, it's a population pyramid. I've seen that, yeah. Because no, the colors. Check the colors. The colors indicate the proportion of each one of those age groups with different education levels. So basically, Wolfgang and the group around him had created population by age and education for basically back then all countries of the world. And I was like, this is really cool because we can now take the cross-sectional dimension and try to learn something out of it. In particular about basically how does the age dimension enter the game when it comes to correlating economic growth with education investment. And he went like, no, well, we don't only have the cross-sectional dimension because these guys have also projected everything back. So now we have the time dimension that will allow us to play around with basically to abstract away from country-specific effects by having a look at how education in the country, within the country, has been evolving over time. We have the age dimension that was not available until now. We had the education dimensions. This was like best Christmas present ever for me. Back then, it was also Christmas time. And what Wolfgang and I did was to put that together into an econometric model and discover that actually the age distribution of educational attainment indeed plays the key role when it comes to understanding the linkage between human capital and economic growth. We found a lot of results that were then meant to enter the policy arena. We found very strong effects of secondary education, in particular in older age groups, for developing economies, and we found basically the productivity effect that comes through creativity and that comes through innovation being concentrated on young individuals with tertiary education in developed economies. Okay? So basically we had found the modeling framework in which we could then create projections for the future and also try to understand what happened in the past. But we also acknowledged that education does things to people that go beyond affecting their productivity. So Wolfgang and I started to get interested in political outcomes in countries, and in particular how education and its distribution across sexes and age groups affects democratization process. I think there was a hidden agenda behind this paper, which is that Wolfgang wanted to write a paper that was co-authored with Jesus and Mohammed in order to, he did not find Siddhartha and took us both. So actually this turned out to be a paper with Wolfgang, Mohammed and Jesus. Try and reject that. So what we were doing is actually to have a look at how education affects democratization process. So we got a whole lot of data on democracy indicators. Needless to say, I'm not going to go into detail, but I'm happy to tell you all the nitty-gritty details if you're interested in. And if you correlate education levels with measures of democracy, you tend to see a very, very solid, robust, positive correlation, even if you concentrate on changes within countries instead of across countries. That's the graph down there. Of course, the effect is a little bit more blurry, but you can still find a positive correlation. And what we did was to go much deeper into that question by having a look at how changes in the age structure, or in the education by age structure and by sex, affected democratization process. And we found a couple of things that partly we confirmed a whole lot of results in the literature, and partly we found new things that nobody had ever looked at before, because nobody had this finer type of, or this granularity in the data that we had. So we found, of course, that education indeed leads to democratization, but that democratization, the effect of education on democratization is extremely asymmetric when it comes to the sex divide, so the female education versus male education. So it's actually investing on female education that tends to have higher returns in terms of democratization processes in the world. We did that for a global sample of countries, and then I remember when we had the first results, we met at Wolfgang's office, presented the result, enjoyed very much what was coming out, and Wolfgang went like, well, it would be cool to have an example, to have like a case study that tells you a little bit about how those effects are taking place and how large they can be. And he went like, well, do you know the country that has had the largest fall in fertility ever in the history of statistics actually had a fall in fertility that came hand in hand with a huge increase in education of females. And probably it would make a really great case study. And that was, of course, Iran. That's where Yara enters the game. So if you have a look at the population pyramids by education in Iran, as you can see, the red color indicates no education. To the right you have the females, to the left you have the males. You can see that between 1970 and 2000, the advancement in terms of closing the gap has been enormous. Okay? So you would expect that actually, well, there would be a whole lot of at least latent demand for democracy in the country and for democratization process. Actually, as I told you, this came hand in hand with a huge decrease in fertility rates. And if we put those numbers into our model and use predictions about, or projections about education developments in Iran over the next years, decades. Back then, the paper is of 2008, where we started in 2008, and what we were predicting was actually a huge increase in latent demand for democracy. You know, with democracy, you can have a whole lot of demand, but you know, it's the trigger comes from the supply side. So that's the part which is difficult to predict. And actually, as we finished the paper, right before I think we sent it to Science, this thing happened, right? And we went like, well, it's a paper, we're making history with this paper. Science had some kind of problems with the paper, probably due to the political situation back then. And we anyway got it into PDR, and still it's a paper that I'm extremely proud of, and that gets cited also very, very often, both by people working on Iran and by people working on democratization processes. Okay, now let me tell you what we are doing right now. So we're passing to the present. One project that both Wolfgang and I are very excited about has to do with projecting Human Development Index figures for basically the whole world in different type of narratives about climate change that are given by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change works on 5 different type of narratives about type of science fiction futures that they call shared socioeconomic pathways. They are divided by, or they are defined by different challenges to adaptation, different challenges to mitigation of climate change, climate change outcomes, and you have basically 5 narratives that are in a very qualitative way set down, and where quantitative projections will have to be created out of it. What Wolfgang and I have been working on is actually on creating such narratives, taking such narratives, putting population projections by age and education and sex on top of them, and creating out of those narratives projections of population that we are linking to income projections. If you have the income side and you have the population side, including the life expectancy projections, then you can out of that make a beautiful projection of Human Development Index, which implies that you're going to have also the type of variable that is mostly used in order to correlate things like vulnerability to climate change induced disasters and stuff like that. Okay? So what we did was exactly that. For each one of the different shared socio-economic pathways, we created projections of the Human Development Index going from today till the year 2100. I'm only showing you here until 2075. You have basically, this is a histogram divided into 2 pieces. The upper part is the histogram corresponding to developing economies. The one underneath is for developed economies. And what you have is the Human Development Index. So you can see how basically the two subsamples behave with respect to each other. So you can see in the year 2010, we start with all of them being the same, and then depending on the type of narrative that we bring into our projections, you could have a world in the year 2075 which would look very, very similar in terms of having converged. That would be the case for SSP1, for example, or for SSP5, or you could have stagnating worlds and polarized worlds that fit then to the type of narratives that the IPCC is giving you. That's the case, for example, for SSP4 or for SSP3. Okay? Great, so this is the type of stuff that we are doing. Our type of modeling can, of course, create extremely rich dynamics and self-contained modeling framework where, using the type of projections that the demographers are doing and the type of models that I am linking with, you can create, for example, for the case of the SSP1, which is a converging world, you can find convergence structures in Human Development Index. Here you have, down there you have the Human Development Index in the year 2010. Here you have the projected change until the year 2075. As you can see, you have this beautiful negative relationship indicating that the higher your human development in the year 2010, the lower the increase that you're going to have in the future, and the other way around. The smaller your Human Development Index in the year 2010, the higher you're going to increase it. So you create what we call beta convergence dynamics. For the case of SSP4, which is this kind of polarized world, you don't find those dynamics. So basically, the initial level of the Human Development Index is not going to be the one that drives the dynamics afterwards. Okay, so much for the present. And now I'm going to present you the very latest results of our paper, so we can discuss them here in front of the audience. So remember, we were talking about the fact that we should concentrate on one of the many projects we have open, is to have a look at growth acceleration episodes. So we were interested in what role does education play in countries that experience what we call growth accelerations. That means that they change the regime of economic growth from a growing regime to another regime where you grow systematically at a higher rate. So we were trying to correlate the occurrence of such a growth acceleration episode with demographic/educational characteristics of the country. That's something that nobody has done in the literature until now. There is some literature on growth, on growth accelerations that has been very much linked to institutional reform. So basically the literature claims that it's institutional reform that creates such growth accelerations. However, there has been quite a lot of discussion in the literature about the lack of robustness of such correlation. We just ran a couple of probit models. I'm not going to give you the details, but we tend to find that age structure as such, good old age structure, does not correlate at all with growth accelerations. When you bring in the educational component, then it turns out that on average, countries that have a working age population that is increasing their educational level also tend to have a higher likelihood of experiencing a growth acceleration episode. So basically we have the first steps to most probably our next paper together. Not only that, talking to Fabian over a beer some weeks ago, they came up, he and another Fabian, came up with the idea of trying to measure education quality using big data, and in particular using data on usage of Wikipedia pages related to science. Yeah, cute. I went like, sounds like a great idea. 2 days afterwards, I had this graph in my email inbox. What you see in the x-axis are the PISA scores for a series of countries. You have two different types of colors that correspond to males and females. That's the math score. And you have also different sizes that correspond to the level of tertiary education, the share of people with tertiary education in those countries. And on the y-axis, since Fabian did not have so much time, it's just overall Wikipedia usage. Am I right, Fabian? Yes. Next step is going to be to, of course, focus on just scientific and mathematical, or eventually technical, science-related pages of Wikipedia. And what you see is a beautiful positive relationship, which is also robust independently of whether we look at just the results of males or the results of females. We will need to control for a whole lot of things, but I think we have something going on in there that could be very, very interesting. Okay? So what does the future, what's expecting Wolfgang in the future, right? There's a beautiful paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science in 2001, where they discovered that actually the age at which great scientific achievements are made has been continuously increasing over time. Which is something that not many people are aware of. You know, you have this Fields medal type of effect, you know, this idea, everything, whatever you have not done in your 20s, you're done and so on. Well, no, it doesn't seem to be the case. It could be related, however, to Wolfgang's aging process, that you tend to find this result in the data. Okay? I call that it's not in the PNA's paper, they don't talk about the Wolfgang effect, I've called it like that. Okay? Which basically implies, projecting that to the future, that the best is indeed still to come. I wish you therefore a happy birthday and all the best for new ideas that will come up in the wake.